10 years after I first walked that street, the lamps were supposed to be the one thing I understood. The city file said the cast iron standards on the Rue de l'Observatoire were installed in 1872, when the new gas concession reached this quarter of Lyon. The engineering journal I pulled from the archive showed a neat elevation of modern gas pillars, with standard fluting and polite ornament, exactly what you would expect from late Victorian infrastructure. But standing there on a wet autumn afternoon in Lyon's old university district, with the 1872 drawing in one hand and an older, stained city map in the other, something refused to line up. The map, dated 1856, already showed the lamp bases in place, the same spacing, the same alignment, almost 20 years before any documented gas network existed here. The circular plinths, their impossible regularity, and one sealed access hatch reminded me uncomfortably of what some researchers now call Tartarian systems. I went home with more photographs than answers. I returned to the Rue de l'Observatoire on an evening when rain slicked the cobblestones and modern traffic hummed distantly around a line of what the city called historic gas lamps. The municipal records were admirably specific. Gas lighting reached this street in 1872 under the supervision of engineer Etienne Morel, whose concession contract listed installation of new iron standards at designated corners throughout the quarter. The paperwork was thorough, professional, exactly what one expects from French municipal administration of that era. The 1856 fire insurance map told a different story. I had photographed it that afternoon in the archive, handling the brittle paper with excessive care. The map marked circular pillars precisely where the lamps stand today, same spacing, same alignment, same geometric relationship to the surrounding buildings, but labeled only as existing. No gas mains appeared in that cartographic layer, no utility infrastructure of any kind connected to those pillars. They simply were, 16 years before Morel's concession began. In the map's marginalia, a regional inset showed Central Asia still shaded as Grande Tartarie. That vast, vague designation European cartographers applied to territories they understood poorly. I caught myself wondering whether the mapmaker who recorded those existing pillars saw any connection to that almost empty label stretching across the continent's interior. I walked the lamp line with a measuring tape, ignoring the rain soaking through my coat. The spacing was geometrically perfect over 4 blocks, identical intervals maintained to within centimeters despite a century and a half of road repairs, utility excavations, and urban transformation. This level of surveying precision in 1856 for pillars serving no documented purpose made no engineering sense. The gas company came later. Someone else had already set the grid. The municipal archive held Etienne Morel's original reports from the 1870s gas installation project. I requested the complete file and spent 2 days working through his meticulous documentation. Trench depths calculated for frost protection, pipe diameters specified for pressure requirements, consumption estimates for each block based on building density and commercial activity. Morel was a thorough engineer who understood that successful infrastructure required comprehensive planning. His treatment of the lamp standards themselves was curiously brief. Throughout dozens of pages detailing underground pipework, valve placements, and connection assemblies, Morel referred to the street-level fixtures only as existing pillars adapted for gas supply. The phrase appeared repeatedly in budget summaries, in installation schedules, in his final completion report, but never with elaboration. He allocated funds for burners, for gas heads, for the fittings connecting pillars to mains. He allocated nothing for the pillars themselves. I searched for any description of casting, transporting, or erecting the iron standards. The file contained no such records. Morel's one surviving sketch showed only the burner assembly in detail. The base, The substantial iron and stone structure I had photographed so carefully on the street appeared as a blank rectangular block, its features deliberately unrendered. In my research notebook, I placed Morel's phrase "existing pillars" beside an illustration from a mid-19th century atlas of what the caption called Tartarian column forms. The image was exaggerated, certainly, produced by artists who had never visited the regions they depicted, but the basic elements matched uncomfortably well: octagonal plinth, recessed rectangular panel at waist height, proportions suggesting function beyond simple lamp support. Alternative researchers who study these patterns call such structures Tartarian distribution nodes. I had always considered that terminology fanciful. The last page of Morel's completion report mentioned connecting legacy pillars to new supply lines. Legacy. In an otherwise precise engineering document, the word hung strangely, acknowledging inheritance without explaining origin. When an engineer inherits a structure, he measures around it. He rarely writes down who built it first. Back on the Rue de l'Observatoire, I knelt in the drizzle and examined the lamp bases with the attention I should have given them years ago. Each standard featured a waist-high rectangular hatch, an iron door set flush with the column surface, secured by heavy bolts, painted over so many times the hardware had become sculptural rather than functional. The hatches were identical in dimension and placement across every lamp in the line, maintaining a consistency that suggested manufacturing standardization rather than individual craftsmanship. Morel's gas company documentation made no mention of access hatches. His drawings showed smooth columns. His specifications listed no hardware for mid-height panels, yet here they were, present on every lamp, clearly original to the castings rather than later additions. The iron itself troubled me. Victorian cast iron from the 1870s typically shows characteristic surface textures, the slight roughness of sand casting, the minor irregularities of period foundry work. These bases displayed a crispness I associated with later manufacturing techniques: sharp edges, precise corners, surfaces almost too smooth for their supposed era. The stone plinths beneath showed wear patterns suggesting greater age than the surrounding pavement, deeper weathering, more pronounced erosion, as if they had endured longer exposure to the elements. A contemporaneous engineering journal article on urban illumination in Lyon included an engraving of this very street. The lamps appeared in their correct positions, but the artist had rendered their bases as featureless blocks, omitting the hatches entirely. The same selective blindness I had noticed in Morel's sketches. In Tartarian research forums, which I had browsed with skeptical detachment until recently, these mid-height hatches are obsessively catalogued as indicators of buried hydraulic or pneumatic systems. The researchers believe the hatches provided access to infrastructure we no longer acknowledge. I had filed such claims under pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random details. Seeing them here, undocumented but real, shifted something. I pressed my ear against the cold iron and heard or imagined the faintest hollow resonance beneath. If the hatch was only decorative, why give it hinges and bolts? Following the lamp line northeast, I reached the Hôtel des Arcades at the corner of the boulevard, a substantial building officially opened in 1884, its limestone facade still displaying the confident ornament of late 19th century commercial architecture. What struck me was not the building itself, but its relationship to the lamps. The hotel's ground floor windows and arcade openings aligned precisely with the pillar spacing, as if the architect had designed around fixed points rather than placing infrastructure to complement his composition. The original blueprints, which I examined in the City Planning Archive, showed a straightforward cellar plan, storage rooms, a boiler chamber, service corridors, nothing unusual for a building of this period and function. A renovation document from 1922 told a different story. The contractor's notes referenced backfilling obsolete subchambers under the north arcade, formerly connected to street pillars. No earlier plan depicted those chambers, no construction record explained their presence. They appeared in the archive only at the moment of their elimination. I arranged access to the present-day basement through the hotel's management, presenting myself as an architectural researcher studying 19th-century commercial construction. In the north foundation wall, I found what the 1922 document had partially described, a curved infill of brick, clearly newer than the surrounding stonework, matching the arc of the street above and aligning with geometric precision to one lamp visible through the pavement grating outside. The brick surface showed mineral staining, calcium deposits, iron oxidation, consistent with prolonged exposure to moisture or pressurized flow. This had not been a dry storage space. Alternative Tartarian research often highlights grand hotels as later occupants of older infrastructure junctions, buildings positioned to exploit pre-existing systems whose original purposes had been forgotten or suppressed. Standing in that basement with my palm against the cold, smooth infill, I understood why the theory persists. Something had been here, something connected to the street pillars, something worth removing and concealing rather than documenting and preserving. The 1922 works log closed with a single terse entry. Removed unidentified ironwork from chamber, no function recorded. You do not usually remove unidentified infrastructure without at least sketching it first, unless its origin is an embarrassment or an inconvenience. I widened my search beyond Lyon, requesting materials from archives in Warsaw, Vienna and St. Petersburg. In each city, I found 19th-century maps where lamp symbols appeared on streets decades before local gasworks began operation, the same temporal anomaly I had discovered on the Rue de l'Observatoire, repeated across thousands of kilometers. A Vienna fire insurance plan from 1842 showed illumination pillars along what would become the Ringstrasse, positioned with the geometric regularity I now recognized as significant. Gas production in Vienna began only in the late 1850s. An early Warsaw map labeled similar symbols simply as old posts, offering no explanation for their presence or purpose. St. Petersburg surveys from the 1830s marked identical features along the Nevsky Prospect, years before the city's gas infrastructure existed. Photographic evidence reinforced the pattern. Early street photographs from each city showed those same posts standing unlit, occupying their permanent positions as if waiting. Later, photographs added gas heads and burner assemblies, but the bases remained unchanged. The same structures adapted rather than replaced. When I overlaid the locations of these anomalous pre-network lamps onto a 19th-century atlas where Tartary still appeared as a geographical designation, a pattern emerged that I could not easily dismiss. The strongest clusters fell within or adjacent to regions that European cartographers had labeled Tartarie or Grande Tartarie in earlier centuries, territories stretching from Eastern Europe deep into Central Asia. Alternative researchers argue this correlation is not coincidence but footprint, evidence of a continental infrastructure network predating the nation-states that later claimed these territories. I noted the overlap without claiming causation. But the distribution was difficult to explain through conventional historical frameworks. These were not random points. They formed corridors, alignments, concentrations that suggested planning rather than independent municipal decisions. On the margin of one Vienna map, an engineer had scribbled in pencil, "Existing pillars to be adapted at later stage." The note was undated. No record indicated when those pillars were first installed, or by whom, or for what original purpose. The lamps appeared at the start of the record fully formed, as if the city planners themselves considered them given. I turned to the technical literature of the period, searching for engineering journals that might explain what municipal archives left obscure. Articles from the 1850s through 1870s celebrated the expansion of gas networks across European cities. Detailed accounts of retort houses, purification systems, cast iron mains, and distribution infrastructure. The writers were engineers proud of their achievements, eager to document the technologies transforming urban life. Their treatment of lamp standards was strangely evasive. A French article from 1863 on modern urban gas systems included sectional diagrams of mains, branch lines, service connections, meters, and burner assemblies, everything rendered with technical precision except the posts themselves. Where column met ground, the illustration showed only a black rectangle, featureless and unexplained. No foundation details, no base specifications, no indication of what lay beneath street level. A British journal from 1867 noted in passing, "Where suitable pillars already exist, it suffices to adapt them with proper burners and connecting apparatus." The statement appeared without elaboration, no examples given, no locations listed, no explanation of what made certain pillars suitable or how they came to exist before the networks they would serve. The pattern of omission extended across publications from multiple countries and decades. Technical writers who obsessed over valve specifications and pipe metallurgy consistently treated street pillars as givens rather than artifacts requiring documentation. The engineering discourse assumed their presence without questioning their origin. Within Tartarian research communities, this editorial vagueness is cited as negative evidence, not proof of hidden history, but an absence consistent with an inherited system being quietly integrated into new infrastructure. The theory suggests that 19th-century engineers encountered existing pillar networks, connected them to modern gas supplies, and simply declined to investigate or document what they had found. I remained cautious about such interpretations, but the pattern of professional silence was genuinely difficult to explain. Engineers document what they design, they record what they build, they take pride in their innovations and preserve their methods for future generations. They do not typically leave blank rectangles where foundations should be. In journals that obsess over valves and screws, why leave the street pillars as anonymous silhouettes? In a Baltic port city I visited during my 8th month of research, I examined renovation plans for a 19th-century public square that had undergone sewer modernization in 1908. The engineering reports from that project described something the municipal authorities had clearly not anticipated discovering: a ring of vaulted brick chambers beneath a circle of ornate lamp posts, structures characterized in the surveyor's notes as previously unknown to municipal plans and possessing unusual robustness and regular geometry inconsistent with recorded construction in this district. The chambers were substantial in scale, approximately 3 meters in diameter, extending 4 to 5 meters below the current street level, constructed with brickwork that the 1908 engineers recognized as significantly older than the surrounding municipal infrastructure. The vaults formed a precise geometric circle beneath the lamp ring visible at street level, their positions corresponding exactly to the surface pillars, as if both elements had been designed and constructed as integrated components of a single, coherent system whose purpose the early 20th century surveyors could not identify. The 1908 engineers faced an essentially bureaucratic problem: what to do with chambers that no municipal plan acknowledged, serving purposes no living official could identify, discovered accidentally during routine sewer work. Their solution was pragmatic rather than investigative: repurpose those vaults that conveniently aligned with new drainage requirements, fill the remainder with rubble and concrete, document the discovery in technical language that acknowledged physical facts without exploring historical implications or preservation possibilities. I visited this square on a cold November afternoon. Grey sky pressing low over cobblestones worn smooth by generations of foot traffic. With assistance from the Municipal Engineering Office, I located surviving access points, where maintenance hatches still provided entry to portions of the underground system. The brick chambers remained partially accessible, their walls clearly older than the adjacent cast-iron sewer pipes installed around and through them. The construction quality was remarkable: precise coursework, carefully shaped voussoirs in the vault ceilings, mortar joints that had survived over a century of groundwater exposure with minimal degradation. At street level, the lamp bases positioned directly above these vaults displayed the same waist-height hatch design I had first documented in Lyon. The proportions were identical, the hardware matched. The relationship between surface pillar and underground chamber repeated a pattern I was beginning to recognize across investigations separated by thousands of kilometers and multiple national archives. Tartarian researchers have highlighted this particular square for years, identifying it as a suspected Tartarian node based primarily on photographic analysis of the lamp bases and their geometric arrangement. They rarely cite the 1908 engineering report directly. Few have likely located it in the provincial archive where it languishes uncatalogued. But that dry municipal document, written by surveyors concerned only with drainage efficiency, quietly supported what their photographs suggested: pre-existing infrastructure of unknown origin discovered by accident, eliminated by bureaucratic convenience rather than preserved for historical study. The report closed with one sentence that remained with me long after I returned the file to the archive. These chambers appear to have served some former distribution purpose, now obsolete. The word distribution appeared without definition. The engineer offered no speculation about what had been distributed, to where, or by what mechanism. Gas networks were still actively expanding across Europe when this surveyor already considered these vaults obsolete, remnants of a former system that predated the infrastructure his generation considered modern. That former system left no name anywhere in the archive. Only its physical traces remained, partially filled with 20th century concrete, beneath lamps that municipal records insisted had been installed decades after the chambers were supposedly abandoned. I turned my attention to a star-shaped plaza in a Central European town often celebrated in architectural histories as an exemplary achievement of Baroque urban design. The geometry was genuinely striking: 5 radiating avenues converging with mathematical precision on a central point, creating sight lines that drew the eye toward monumental buildings positioned at each terminus. Tourism literature attributed the layout to 18th century royal planners seeking to impose rational Enlightenment order on the organic chaos of medieval street patterns. A city plan from 1810, which I examined in the regional archive after considerable bureaucratic persistence, showed the star geometry already complete. Tall pillars were marked at each of the 5 points, substantial structures occupying positions of obvious geometric significance within the overall design. Gas infrastructure would not reach this town for another 50 years. The pillars predated any documented utility purpose by half a century, yet they anchored a spatial arrangement too precise and too intentional to be coincidental or purely decorative. When gas finally arrived in the 1860s, municipal council minutes recorded the official decision that existing pillars in the central place shall be adapted for lamp purposes with minimal disturbance to stonework and foundations. The bureaucratic language acknowledged inheritance explicitly while declining to explain origin. No record in any archive I searched indicated who had erected those pillars, when their construction had occurred, or why structures intended merely to support future gas lamps would require foundations so substantial that mid-19th century engineers considered them worth preserving rather than replacing. I visited the plaza across several days, measuring what I could access without excavation equipment or official permits that would have required explanations I was not prepared to offer. The pillar bases were dramatically oversized relative to any conceivable structural requirement for supporting a lamp. Massive stone plinths that would be appropriate for bearing significant vertical loads, anchoring equipment under hydraulic pressure, or stabilizing machinery, generating substantial vibration. The geometry of their placement was perfect to within centimeters across the full diameter of the star pattern, surveying precision that would challenge modern GPS-equipped equipment and seemed frankly impossible for the optical instruments and chain measurements available in the early 19th century. Star-shaped layouts and radial alignments appear frequently in Tartarian architectural theory, usually connected to star forts and their mysterious global distribution across continents that supposedly lacked the communication networks necessary for such design coordination. Here the shape existed not in military fortification, but in civilian urban design, anchored by pillars whose original function remained undocumented in any official source. The visual connection to Tartarian motifs was uncomfortable but increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The modern electric lamps that now crown these ancient pillars glow each evening above foundations whose true purpose, 2 centuries ago, no local archive acknowledges, explains, or apparently ever questioned. Someone shaped this space with a geometric precision we still navigate daily and a functional purpose we no longer record or remember. Across multiple cities and archives, I began systematically tracing 20th century modernization projects to understand how older infrastructure had been treated as utility technologies evolved from gas to electricity to fiber optics. The documentary pattern that emerged was remarkably consistent. The same bureaucratic language appearing in files separated by decades and thousands of kilometers, describing the same categories of intervention with the same studied vagueness that seemed designed to acknowledge physical facts while foreclosing historical inquiry. Simplification of underground arrangements, rationalization of obsolete substructures, removal of redundant chambers beneath lamp lines, modernization of legacy pillar infrastructure. The phrases recurred across languages and administrative traditions like a liturgy, acknowledging the existence of unknown systems while carefully declining to investigate their origins or document their configurations before destruction rendered such investigation impossible. A 1934 Paris planning document for new underground electrical cabling noted matter-of-factly the demolition of old brick wells beneath lamp lines in the 14th arrondissement. Contents not of use to current works and removed without detailed survey. No drawings survived of those wells, no photographs documented their construction, their contents, or their spatial relationship to the street infrastructure above. The wells existed in the archival record only at the moment of their elimination, appearing as obstacles to be efficiently cleared rather than artifacts warranting study or preservation. Before and after photographs from multiple cities showed lamp bases losing physical complexity over successive decades of municipal improvement. Lower sections that once featured hatches, access panels, and ventilation grills were encased in poured concrete during mid-century renovations. Access points were welded shut and painted over. Elaborate cast-iron standards with their mysterious mid-height doors were sometimes replaced entirely with slender steel poles that served only to hold lights aloft, eliminating any material suggestion that street illumination infrastructure had once involved purposes more complex than mounting a bulb at convenient height. Tartarian researchers interpret this documented pattern as evidence of deliberate, coordinated erasure, systematic suppression of physical evidence that would challenge accepted historical narratives about technological development and infrastructure origin. Conventional engineering history offers simpler motivations. legitimate safety concerns about underground access, cost reduction through standardization, simplified maintenance procedures requiring less specialized knowledge. So the institutional motivations differ fundamentally in their implications. The physical result is functionally identical. Older systems vanish from the built environment, replaced by infrastructure that requires no uncomfortable questions about what preceded it or who built the foundations it occupies. A maintenance notebook from 1948, preserved in a city archive otherwise meticulous about utility records and construction documentation, contained one notably terse entry. Removed archaic iron pipe discovered under pillar at Rue X during cable installation. Pipe not connected to any current municipal network. Purpose unknown. Filled resulting cavity with ite. No sketch accompanied the entry, no photograph, no measurement of diameter, length or direction, no speculation about what the pipe had once carried, where it had originated, or where it might have led. An entire piece of unknown infrastructure encountered by chance and eliminated without documentation, reduced to 12 words in a maintenance log. What does it say about our relationship with the past when trained engineers encounter a complete system they do not recognize and simply cut it away without curiosity? In a North Sea harbour town I visited near the end of my active research, I examined a Victorian promenade lined with elegant iron posts that tourist literature described as historic gas lamps carefully restored to their original splendour. The characterization was confidently specific. The local gas company's historical records, which I accessed through a regional industrial heritage archive, told a notably different story. These particular fixtures had never been connected to the municipal gas network, not disconnected during later electrification programs, never connected to gas supply in the first place, despite their obvious external design as gas lamp standards complete with burner housings and glass enclosures. I inspected one post closely on a morning when thick fog muted the harbour sounds and few tourists disturbed my examination. Beneath the decorative lamp housing, where the fluted iron column met its substantial stone base, I discovered an open grille covering a vertical shaft that descended into darkness well beyond the reach of my flashlight. A faint but unmistakably steady flow of cool air rose through the grille, not a random draft caused by temperature differential or wind patterns, but a consistent current suggesting sustained pressure difference between the surface atmosphere and some substantial enclosed space below street level. Nearby utility plans, which I obtained through a formal records request to the Municipal Engineering Office, labelled these shafts simply as old ventilation for harbour works. The underground galleries they supposedly ventilated were brick-lined passages far wider and more substantially constructed than any drainage channel or cable conduit would require. The brickwork was clearly older than the 19th century quay wall constructed visibly around and above these passages. Their scale suggested volumes of air, or perhaps fluid, moving in quantities that simple basement ventilation could not explain. The iron lamps positioned above each shaft appeared to be precisely what Tartarian researchers have long suggested such structures represent: functional disguises for infrastructure vents, decorative Victorian housings added to normalize and aestheticize the continued presence of systems no municipal authority wished to explain to curious citizens or document for future historians. A harbour engineering report from 1902, which I located in the Port Authority's historical files, addressed these posts with unusual directness. Old pillars retained as ventilation outlets for ancient harbour works, decorative lampheads added for purposes of municipal appearance and public acceptability. The phrase ancient works appeared without chronological definition or historical elaboration. The engineer acknowledged significant antiquity, offered no date or origin theory, and proceeded immediately to cost estimates for the decorative lamp additions that would render the ventilation function invisible to casual observation. Deep in one shaft that remained accessible through a corroded maintenance grate, my flashlight beam caught the outline of a substantial valve wheel mounted on a large diameter pipe curving away into darkness at an angle suggesting connection to a much larger system. The wheel was perhaps 40 centimeters across with 6 heavy spokes, hardware clearly designed to regulate significant flow volumes, not the trickle of condensation drainage. A rope ladder had once provided regular access to this valve. Only the iron mounting brackets remained, still firmly bolted to the dressed stone shaft wall, rusted but structurally sound after more than a century without maintenance. Whatever that valve once regulated was now permanently beyond physical reach, accessible only visually and partially at that. Whatever distribution system it had controlled, water, gas, air, or substances we no longer recognize, had been administratively sealed away and bureaucratically redesignated as mere passive ventilation for conveniently undefined ancient works. We are comfortable calling something ancient when we no longer need to understand it. We are considerably less eager to acknowledge that it once powered infrastructure we still use daily. I spread my accumulated research materials across a library table reserved for the purpose. Photographs from Lyon, Vienna, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, the Baltic Square, the Central European Star Plaza, the North Sea Harbour Promenade. Maps spanning more than a century of cartographic evolution. Engineering reports from half a dozen national archives in 4 languages. Renovation documents recording the systematic elimination of underground systems that no 20th century engineer claimed to understand or considered worth preserving. The pattern emerging from this accumulation had become impossible to dismiss as coincidence, confirmation bias, or the overactive imagination of a researcher too deep in specialized material to maintain proper perspective. In each documented case, substantial pillars, cast iron, dressed stone, or sophisticated combinations of both, demonstrably predated the utility networks they were later claimed to serve. In each case, 19th and 20th century engineers attached gas burners, electrical fittings, or decorative housings to structures they had clearly inherited rather than designed or constructed. The direction of adaptation was consistent across every example, from new network to existing pillar, never from purpose-built pillar to subsequent network. The infrastructure existed first, waiting. The official explanations came decades later, grafted onto foundations whose origins no document addressed. When I overlaid the densest geographical clusters of these anomalous pre-network pillars onto a 19th century atlas where Tartary still appeared as a recognized cartographic designation, the resulting correlation was genuinely striking. The heaviest concentrations of undocumented pillar infrastructure fell within territories that European mapmakers had labeled as Tartarian for centuries, or along the overland trade routes that had connected Tartarian regions to European ports and commercial centers since medieval times. The pattern was emphatically not random scatter across the continental map. It suggested planning corridors, infrastructure networks, distribution systems designed at scales that individual cities or even nation-states could not plausibly have coordinated given documented 19th century communication and administrative capabilities. Modern Tartarian researchers propose the existence of a unified older infrastructure grid, hydraulic, pneumatic, possibly energetic in ways our current physics does not fully acknowledge, whose visible remnants include these mysterious lamp pillars and the sealed chambers discovered beneath them. My accumulated evidence could not confirm such sweeping civilizational claims with any scholarly certainty, but it supported, at minimum, the documented existence of an inherited, officially unacknowledged pillar network spanning vast geographical distances constructed to engineering specifications that remained remarkably consistent across political boundaries, linguistic zones, and supposed historical periods. Whether that network deserved the specific label Tartarian remained a question I could not definitively answer. But I could no longer maintain that the question itself was historically absurd or methodologically irresponsible to ask. I assembled a composite digital image as a final analytical exercise, dozens of lamp bases from different countries, photographed from standardized angles during my research travels, scaled to match and overlaid with transparency. The octagonal plinths aligned with uncomfortable precision. The hatch placements matched across examples separated by thousands of kilometers. The proportions repeated with a consistency that spoke unmistakably of manufacturing standardization in an era when no documented institution, no international body, no imperial administration possessed the demonstrated reach or coordinating authority to standardize street furniture designs across linguistic and political boundaries. Different languages on the surrounding street signs, different municipal administrations in the archival records, different centuries in the official construction dates, the same circle of iron at the street's edge, waiting for explanations that never came. I stepped back from the accumulated physical evidence to consider a more fundamental question: how infrastructures are recorded in official archives, and how they are systematically forgotten without requiring any deliberate conspiracy to suppress them. Utility companies document what they finance, design, construct, and maintain. They create extensive paper trails for budget justifications, liability protection, regulatory compliance, and operational continuity. What they inherit silently, structures already physically present when their legal concessions begin, generates no purchase invoices, no construction schedules, no engineering specifications, no contractor payments. Pre-existing infrastructure enters the documentary record only obliquely, as existing pillars to be adapted or legacy systems to be connected to modern supply. This is not conspiracy requiring secret coordination. It is institutional behavior operating exactly as bureaucratic logic dictates. When an existing pillar proves structurally convenient, a gas company accountant labels it ready-made support and records only the cost of attaching a burner assembly, not the vastly larger expense of manufacturing and installing the pillar itself. When underlying chambers prove operationally inconvenient, a municipal engineer labels them obsolete substructure and authorizes filling them with concrete, without first documenting their configuration, investigating their origin, or preserving samples for future analysis. Neither institutional act requires malicious intent or coordinated suppression. Both effectively erase origin from the recoverable historical record through routine administrative procedure. Tartarian researchers often emphasize narratives of deliberate suppression, shadowy authorities actively concealing material evidence of a lost civilization whose existence would destabilize accepted historical frameworks. The archival pattern I had documented across months of research suggested something considerably simpler and perhaps ultimately more troubling: bureaucratic indifference to questions that complicate approved narratives without offering immediate, practical utility. The erasure I traced was not active, but passive, not conspiratorial, but institutional, not malicious, but merely efficient. And yet that very mechanism of institutional forgetting is exactly how evidence of a prior infrastructural system would vanish from historical memory if such a system had actually existed. Not through locked vaults and classified documents requiring security clearances, but through poured concrete and administrative indifference. Through engineers who measure carefully around inherited structures without asking who built them or why. Through renovation projects that remove unidentified ironwork without sketching its configuration first. Through maintenance logs that note the discovery of archaic pipes in one sentence and their destruction in the next. The evidence gap I had documented remained remarkably consistent across every archive I visited, regardless of national tradition or administrative language. Invoices for gas pipes, records of burner installations, photographs of workers connecting distribution mains, all abundantly preserved in organized files. The first plan that decided where the pillars would stand, the engineering drawing that specified their complex bases and sealed hatches, the construction record that documented their original installation, nowhere to be found in any archive, in any country, in any language. A planning memorandum from a 1950s modernization project in a major European capital stated the operative institutional principle with admirable clarity. Existing pillars to be considered permanent urban furniture. Questions of origin not relevant to present works and not to be investigated at municipal expense. When origin is officially labelled irrelevant, history does not require a shredder or a locked vault. A backhoe and a concrete truck will accomplish the same erasure far more efficiently. I returned to the Rue de l'Observatoire on a different evening, months after my investigation began, to stand once more beneath the same lamp that had first troubled my comfortable assumptions about Victorian infrastructure and its documented origins. The gas network that Etienne Morel had connected in 1872 was long since decommissioned, its cast-iron mains abandoned in place beneath the street or removed during subsequent utility upgrades. The burner head that once held a delicate gas mantle now housed a harsh LED fixture, its cold white light replacing the warm amber glow of coal gas combustion that 19th century residents would have recognized. The base remained unchanged, the stone plinth, the iron column, the sealed hatch with its painted-over bolt. The infrastructure that mattered, the part that predated Morel's documented work by at least 16 years, stood as solid and as unexplained as it had on that first rainy afternoon when a discrepancy between an 1856 map and an 1872 engineering report had started me down a path I had not anticipated travelling. I had walked this street dozens of times over the years before that afternoon, without truly seeing what stood before me. The post had been urban furniture, a historical prop, a quaint reminder of gaslit evenings that tourists photographed without curiosity and residents passed without notice. Now I saw something else entirely, a node in a distribution system that predated its official Victorian explanation by decades at minimum, connected to chambers beneath a nearby hotel that no architectural blueprint acknowledged, aligned with structures of identical design across a continent in patterns that defied the organizational and communication capacities of the era that claimed credit for their construction. The symmetry of the lamp line remained unnervingly precise after a century and a half of urban transformation. The foundation stones still dramatically exceeded any structural requirement for supporting a simple lamp. The iron casting retained a manufacturing sharpness conspicuously absent in nearby railings and fences officially dated to the same Victorian period. The hatch remained sealed, its function undocumented in any archive I had searched across 4 countries and 6 languages. I could no longer view this post as a simple product of 19th century municipal improvement, a straightforward artifact of the gas age installed by documented engineers for clearly understood purposes. At minimum, it represented a later system grafted onto an older infrastructure skeleton that official records had never wholly acknowledged and subsequent renovations had systematically obscured. Whether that skeleton deserved the specific name Tartarian, whether it connected physically and historically to the vast territories that European cartographers once labelled with that word across the interior of Asia, remained a question I could no longer easily dismiss as fringe speculation. I could not answer it with certainty either. The evidence permitted the question. It did not compel any single conclusion. My hand rested on the sealed hatch as it had on that first autumn afternoon when the investigation began. The iron was cold beneath my palm, slightly rough with accumulated layers of municipal paint, solid in a way that suggested considerable mass continuing below the visible street surface. In the archive across the city, a faded insurance map dated 1856 marked this exact location, with a small inked circle and 2 words in careful period script: Old Pillar. The map predated the gas by 16 years. The pillar was already here, already old, already unexplained. We light our streets each evening from foundations whose first purpose we no longer remember, whose original builders left no names in any archive, and whose true function, if it was ever recorded, has been filed under silence and buried beneath concrete. The sealed hatch offered no answers. The investigation had found its limit in physical evidence that pointed toward questions the documentary record could not resolve. Somewhere beneath the cobblestones, chambers that once served purposes we no longer acknowledge remain filled with 20th century concrete, their contents removed without documentation, their origins never investigated, their connection to identical structures across a continent never officially examined. The Tartarian hypothesis persists because the silence persists, and the lamps, the old pillars, remain standing, waiting for questions that institutional history has declared irrelevant to ask.